Okay, for our next section on unit objectives, that's our second strategy. These are the crystal clear expectations for students. Now we say crystal clear, that means they're in print, they're in writing. Not just I said this in class. When I said it, somebody's mind may have been somewhere else. A student's mind may have been somewhere else. They may not even been in class that day. So these must be written and handed to students before we ever start lecture. It would be similar to asking a first-year faculty member and telling them we have some very specific things we're going to evaluate you on into the first year to see if we want to keep you employed or not. And the first thing you would ask as a faculty member was, well, can I have a list of those? So, of course, you're expected to be handed a list of expectations of what you need to know or be able to do for that first test. This is absolutely the very first step to the learning process, which is why so many folks start off with an uphill battle if we skip this first step. It's got to be an uphill battle from then on. So to keep things running smooth, it's very much like critical thinking. Critical thinking has a series of logical steps. The first step is make observations. If we skip the first step, then what we're doing, we can't go to the next step, which is formulate a hypothesis. And a hypothesis is an educated guess, educated based on the observations. But we can't make that if we didn't make the observations. So then the process just becomes a guess. It's the same way with these expectations. Students need to know what they need to be able to do or know for that first test. These are not your traditional study guides. All faculty that mentioned these gave them within a few days of the test, these study guides. So knowingly or unknowingly, what we were training students to do was show up unprepared for class, wait till you get the study guide, and then just cram for shallow learning, which not really true learning anyway, but it'll get you through the test. And then we wonder why they don't remember it a few weeks later. And no, these are not required by our accrediting agency yet. They do require GEOs, PLOs, SLOs, general education outcome, program level outcomes, student learning outcomes, but they don't require you to let a student know exactly what they need to be responsible for the first assessment. So that's just the low bar set by some accrediting agencies. That's why we need an action verb when we're writing these objectives. What will the student have to be able to do with this information? Will they have to explain it, list it, state it, recognize it, discuss it? We don't want to use words like, well, you need to know this or understand that. That's much too vague. And we also want to have progressive levels of higher order thinking. We wouldn't want all our objectives to just be able to state this or recognize this. We want to be able to explain or contrast, compare. And then also allows us to incorporate those soft life skills and attitudes that are so important to the workplace. And many times are some of the most important things we teach in a general education class, especially those first term gateway courses. So incorporating these also into the unit objectives allows students to know we're putting a focus on them improving, whether it be communication skills, critical thinking, problem solving, team building, conflict resolution. So what these unit objectives, it empowers students with more control over their learning. This would make sense. It reminded me of a conference when we were talking about how to write objectives, and somebody in the back of the room raised their hand and said, well, if we give students these, they'll know everything that's on the test. And you're thinking, that's the whole point, is put them more control over their learning. What do you think a first-generation low-income student shows up for class? They already don't feel like their efforts control their success, which, by the way, was the answer given by over 30% of Americans on a major survey in this country by the Brookings Institute. Over 30% of Americans said their efforts did not control their success. So taking a student that comes from a very unstructured environment with little control and putting them in an environment in the classroom where they continue to have little control is a recipe for disaster. So this increases preparation not only for the student, but also for the instructor, because we have a specific format to follow. Keeps us focused on what our goals and objectives are. And when you put discipline together to work on these, like a light course, an introductory biology course or introductory psychology course, putting faculty together to work towards a common goal of designing a list of objectives. If our content is that important, we ought to be able to agree on what the basic objectives for each of those units are. And in doing so, it'll also allow to cull off some of the content. That's the most important response given by folks who have gone through these unit objectives writing these unit objectives is they said it allowed them to eliminate material that was either redundant or it was too detailed. Students can figure out the details if they understand the basic concepts and principles. What they can't do is memorize a bunch of details and that allow them to understand the concepts and principles. So we focus on the concepts and principles. We realize we don't need as many of the details. And if it's difficult for someone to write these, maybe it's their first time writing them, then what we don't do is we don't copy them from the textbook. That's a cop-out. The textbook has way more information than we can cover in a term, so we're not going to copy the ones from the textbook. What we can do is take our test. Because those tests, we know what we want students to know for the test, work backwards. If the first question on your test said state 5 things, then the first objective be able to state these 5 things. And what this does is promote preparation and accountability for the student. They'll come into class better prepared. In an introductory biology course, this combined with the other 4 strategies on the workshop, these unit objectives, over 5 times the number of students showing up prepared for class because they knew what to show up prepared for. See, we know the old adage about, well, read the first 2 chapters and show up on Monday. And we knew the odds of any student doing that. If we're lucky, 1 or 2 students was slim to none. But yet we sometimes continue with that same format and wonder why it doesn't work. So by saying walking in on Monday, we'll be covering the first 4 objectives. Matter of fact, there'll be a short quiz at the beginning of the period, and then we'll get into the 4 objectives. Allows students to focus in, brings that course more into focus. It's not so overwhelming for them. And like an article written by the University of California, Berkeley said, it reduces the amount of material to be covered. We're in a day of time where just transmission of knowledge is a waste of time in class. There's a point for it, and we have to do that sometimes. But the majority of the class ought to be used for critical thinking and problem solving and working on those life skills and understanding concepts. So this article from University of California, Berkeley talked about the country's obsession with content in a day and age where we have more information on an iPhone than all the libraries in the state put together. So this content obsession is what unit objectives help with also. And what that does, it increases the quality of learning by sacrificing some of the quantity of details. And when we're writing these objectives, of course, we want to do progressively higher order thinking. We don't want everything just be remember. We want to be able to apply it and evaluate it and create it. Because like we said, we're required to have these GEOs, goals, strategic initiatives. That's all institutional level. And then program level and student learning outcomes, that's for the course and program. But for the students, they need a list of those unit objectives, clear expectations. Those clear expectations are what will get us better results, what will get us better students and better prepared students. So keeping that in mind, what we want you to do for unit objectives, on that list of 9 problems that affect student learning from the beginning of our workshop, write an O for objectives beside each problem that could be helped by providing these crystal clear expectations.